Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to this webinar Encounter, which is the first of a series of 3 where we're seeking to wrestle with some very difficult themes. And today it is Remembering and Memorial. Thrive Ireland seeks to enable church and community transformation through a global lens. We've hosted 2 previous conferences, which was From Africa to Ireland and Speaking Out. And 2 of our speakers today joined us for the first of these as we sought to learn from innovative peacebuilding practice in other global contexts. 20 years after signing the Good Friday Agreement, life in Northern Ireland has improved considerably. A return to the conflict of the past is, for most people, quite unimaginable. However, sadly, we still have a divisive legacy of sectarianism, poverty and socioeconomic neglect in communities most affected by the conflict, the negative presence of paramilitaries, and a political inertia that has paralysed any reconciliation policy from our devolved government. The current environment created by Brexit is also contributing to the tensions within the political sphere and at community level. We may have achieved an internationally recognised peace process, but we have not relationally made peace. We remain demographically divided, often unreconciled in our experiences of hurt, unable at either political and community level to affirm a reconciliation policy, and in general, we've settled for tolerance as a basis for building a shared future. A Christian vision of the common good, we believe, is not just about the values of rights legislation, but also the virtues of human relationships in which meaningful encounter and dialogue are possible. Thrive Ireland's very name wants us to move towards a society that can thrive and flourish, where we can have life and have it in all its fullness. When Christophe Mbonengabo came to visit Northern Ireland to speak at our first conference, he also travelled to Lisnaskea to and bring encouragement to members of the South East Fermanagh Foundation, SEFF. This began a relationship which has grown and developed both between Christophe, Thrive Ireland and SEFF members. Together, we've been planning a trip for a group of victim survivors from Northern Ireland to travel to Rwanda to meet with groups of victim survivors of the 1994 genocide and with government and community groups to learn about Rwanda's journey, to learn about the difficulties and struggles as well as its successes since that terrible time. Because of COVID, this event has had to be postponed until next year, but we are really excited about the possibilities that it will open up. So one of the aims of this series, Encounter, is to enable learning from the global context for all of us here in Northern Ireland. The second is to create space to enable people to tell their stories and be heard, for grief to be given a voice, and for experiences to be validated. The theologian Walter Brueggemann says, "There can be no healing from hurt without the public affirmation of the legitimacy of your story." And we believe that it is part of the church's role to facilitate space for this to happen. I'd ask you throughout to please use the Q&A button and to ask questions. And I'm delighted to say that Derek Poole is our facilitator today, and we'll get through as many as we can in the time of discussion that the panel have. And it's now my privilege to introduce our first speaker today. Christophe Mbonengabo was born in 1974 in exile in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. Christophe lives in Kigali, Rwanda, with his wife Diane and their 5 children. He's able to speak powerfully into the topics of forgiveness, reconciliation and justice, as well as the historical background to the genocide and post-genocide consequences in all areas of community life in Rwanda, as well as the reconstruction process. He's the founder and executive director of CARSA, which stands for Christian Action for Reconciliation and Social Assistance, which has a heart to address the growing need to reconcile wounded Rwandans and address the disharmony and trauma seen among young people, churches, and communities. He has led his team in the development of different programs to respond to the post-genocide reconciliation including a great programme called Cow for Peace. This unique intervention seeks to foster reconciled relationships between genocide survivors and their direct perpetrators through 3 programmes. So thank you so much, Christoph, and I'd like to hand over to him now.
Thank you very much, Diane, and it's a pleasure for me to be part of this conference and to speak to you virtually as we can be pleased to have this opportunity while people cannot meet physically due to the pandemic. And yeah, let me start from where Diane ended and giving a very brief background of sorry for that. I was saying that I want to start by giving a very brief background about the genocide that's happened in the last 26 years in Rwanda. Within 100 days, Rwanda has experienced a genocide where about 1 million Tutsi were killed. And the killing were organized by the government, executed by the armed militia group and ordinary women and men who killed their friends, their relatives, and their neighbors. And all that happened when Rwanda was among the few Christian countries in the world, with about 95% being Christians by then. And talking about remembrance and memorial, I would just start with a few questions that came in my mind when I was reflecting about this topic. The first question is, what is the purpose of memorials? And what is the purpose of remembrance in the context of post-violence or post-genocide? Why are some historical events or individuals deemed worthy to be remembered or commemorated while others are not? How can individuals and communities remember their past in a very constructive way? What is the impact of memorials and on reconstructions and reconciliation in post-violence society? In the context of Rwanda, talking about memorial and remembrance, we need to look at from a perspective of what's the benefit, what's remembrance memorial effort can create as opportunity for survivors and societies. And that include, one, memorials and remembrance give voice and acknowledgement to the victims and survivors. In our context, many survivors from the genocide did not know where their beloved ones were killed from or who was involved killing them. So having memorials and time to remember help those families and communities to be acknowledged and have a voice to express their pain. Secondly, it's becoming a location for mourning and healing. Because in normal circumstances, when you've lost someone, you have the person. But in the context of violence, such as the genocide, there's no that opportunity. That's why memorials and remembrance time provide that opportunity. But also it preserves the truth of what happened. We all know that the tendency after violence is denial. And so having memorials provide that opportunities where the truth is stored and shared, and people will learn about what happened. But also, it represents a form about memorials and remembrance without thinking, and also bringing into justice and reparation. In addition to that, serve as a basic for non-recurrence and preventing impunity. It creates a space for public education, dialogue, and engaging second generation. It provides a basis for dialogue and reconciliation between groups in conflict, because it creates that space where people come together and start reflecting and think about their future. CARSA, we've been working with young people who were born after the genocide. Means the people who did not witness the genocide, but were the second generation. And this picture represents one of the sessions we had with students from high school who are between the age of stay confused about the history, but they learn from the first information that's provided by the Genocide Memorial, whereby they learn from the historical background, but also they understand how the genocide was organized and who was involved. And thus provide a clear information and learning space for these young people as the future generation of Rwanda. There are some challenges or obstacles for memorials and remembrance. One is the lack of political willingness.
Sorry, it appears we've lost Christoph at the moment. Hopefully we will get him back on shortly. If just bear with us for a moment or two, we'll see if he gets started again on his final few slides. Thank you. I'm sorry, everyone. It appears we've lost Christoph for the moment. What we will do is we will have Derek will join us now to move on to our second speaker. And then if we do have Christoph join us again, we will finish up his presentation at the end of today.
Yes, hello. My name is Derek Poole, and I've been asked to facilitate the three speakers after Christoph, and we're sorry to have lost him. Hopefully we'll get that back fairly soon. So let me go straight into the next speaker, the Reverend Yuseni Zimbanda, who is the Chief Executive of the Zimbabwean Christian Alliance. This is a nationwide organization in Zimbabwe that facilitates a range of conflict transformation programs that have been very effective in addressing conflict issues in that context, in that situation, both at a grassroots level and also level. Yuseni's work includes issues of social justice, government accountability, issues of a changing society and relationships between society and the church, issues of nation building, and in what is a politically contested environment. Usaini has always put at the heart of that work, and having spent time with him, I saw this. He's always put at the heart of that work the issue of providing a voice for those who are most marginalized from the conflict, and those who are most marginalized in society, those who somehow or another have been outside the dialogue that is necessary for the building of peace and justice and reconciliation in the Zimbabwean context. So we're delighted to have him with us today and look forward to his presentation.
Thank you so much, Derek. I'm also glad to be here. Just going to pick up from where Christopher left. I'm glad that he actually gave us the basic definitions. But for those that have joined us that might not know, Zimbabwe is in Southern Africa. We're next to South Africa, and we also have got the Victoria Falls. So I think that's one place that everyone knows. But today I'm going to give us first a general of around remembering and memorialization, because as human beings, it's something that is universal. Where people feel pain, where people feel issues of injustice, they all feel the same way. So where I will start from is just talking about remembering and memorialization as a universal principle. I think that when wars are fought, when there is conflict, we always see them as news stories or historical narratives or statistics, so many people killed and so forth. But sometimes we don't realize the traumatic footprints and the wounds that are left in the collective memories of individuals and communities. Those are not recorded in our history books, but there's so much pain that's there, whether it is in Northern Ireland, Belfast, Zimbabwe, Matabeleland, or whether it is Rwanda, and children that get affected. Einstein, in 2002, writes in his book entitled Finding a Meaning in Memory, and he gives a very good critique of collective memory studies, that collective memories are communications about the meaning of the past that are anchored in a collective memory of that community. Communities share traumatic experiences. I'm always reminded that when we drive in some of the areas where people have been affected by trauma or atrocities, you find little children on to them about experiences that their parents had when an is how to communicate about the past and traumatic experiences that open fresh wounds in a way that transforms that pain into a healing, not just for them, but for the whole community. So the big question we want us to answer today is also, how do communities construct their own memories and pains through memorialization, and also be able to tell their story in a way that recovers the truth, but also brings healing. It's easier in other places like Rwanda, where the state is involved or supports or creates space for communities to go through that process. But in Zimbabwe, which got its independence in 1980, we are still struggling to have that space created. Yes, we have got a National Peace and Reconciliation Commission, but it is under-resourced, and we don't have enough political will to ensure that we get a process like the one in South Africa or Rwanda done. So what has happened is that Zimbabwean churches that we work with under Christian Alliance, we are in more than 40 communities. We've got 40 local peace communities, committees. This local peace infrastructure is the one that is working with communities to create space for the communities to go through a process of truth recovery, of remembering the past, of transforming that memory, and also of constructing spaces where they can memorialize their pain, their wounds, but be able to say, this should never happen again. So for Zimbabwe, we came through an independent struggle that is 65 up to about 90. It was a bloody liberation struggle. My focus on our talk today is on part of Zimbabwe, where immediately after independence, the government targeted the local ethnic groups that are there because they're from a different liberation movement. And we had what we can say is another genocide on a smaller scale from the one in Rwanda. And these 20,000 people were mostly from one ethnic group. So we are working in southern part of Zimbabwe by a group called, an army set up called the Fifth Brigade. It was trained by the North Koreans. And they just brutalized, killed, and massacred people. As you can see in those pictures, those army trucks, when they moved into a village, they would leave behind a trail of destruction. Blood, children were smashed against rocks. Pregnant women, they were cut in their bellies. And these are the stories you find. The Catholic Commission for Peace and Justice actually did some research and did a report which they released in 1997, which was called Breaking the Silence. And in that report, they narrated the whole event of what happened. So now, Zimbabwe was quiet from the time 1983 when this happened up to 1997. It was a moment of silence. So that's why the Catholics called it breaking the silence. No one could tell their story about what happened. No one was allowed to recall the memory of their pains. And like I explained, you are looking at, like in the village that I'm talking about here called Isloane. Isloane is a local language, which means the lion, because they used to have a lot of lions there. They are near Wange National Game Park. But in that village, more than 100 homesteads have got graves of people killed. Sometimes it will be passerby. People were passing near that homestead and they will be caught and killed there. We have mass graves, more than 30 people in one grave, more than 25 people in one grave. In one instant, we had a family where the entire family was killed and just buried, and the homestead was burnt down. So it's a very painful story, and only one person escaped, whom we are working with just now, to go through memory and to deal with that past. So when we talk about remembering and memory within the Zimbabwean context, because the state is not yet fully open, so you won't find memorial sites like in Rwanda, where they've already built huge memorial sites. Whether you're in Kigali, you can see them. But now in Zimbabwe, it's different. It's the community working with churches that is trying to preserve that memory, transform that memory, and also at the same time, ensure that we build on what's there. So there are a few things we have done. The first one is we allow the communities to tell their stories. So they talk about their stories. It's therapy. The second thing is we allow the communities to, we allow them to identify, mark the graves and secure the graves where their relatives were killed. As you can see, the first picture that we showed was that of a grave. So allow them to do that with the hope that in the future, those will be memorial sites. The third thing is journaling. We allow the older generation to tell their story to the younger generation, who then write the story down. So it's a lot of therapy. Instead of just passing trauma to them, we allow them to write their stories. So we call that journaling, healing through journaling. So they write their stories. As I speak now, as I speak to you now, we have more than 100 stories that were written, handwritten, and then we digitalize them to preserve them and secure them. But when they talk about their story and we write that story, we also provide a video to document. So we allow the children, the youth of the affected parents to hear the story and then film it, document it in such a way that they tell the story through their own eyes. How are they feeling? Then the last thing is some of the families ask for reburials or exhumations. So which means they go and dig, but that is a very specialized thing. So we work with another organization called Ugutula Trust. So they do the exhumations. As I speak to you now, government is preparing a bill that will allow some of the people to exhume. But some of them have said, we cannot rebury our relatives until we know the truth. What happened? Who killed our people? So they tell their own side of the story about what happened, but they're demanding that government also comes on board to tell its own story. Why did they send the army? Who sent, Mugabe described it as a moment of madness. But, why did government decide to do that? So it's something that people are asking. Now, we have managed to capture the victim's story. Is documented. The memory from the victim is well documented. But we need government to speak on his behalf. But that has not yet happened. We are praying that it happens. But we've realized that most of the victims are now in their 60s and 70s. And the danger is that some of them could pass on. So what we've tried to do is to allow them to talk about their story. We capture what they are saying, digitalize it, preserve it as memory, and then begin to work with them on how we could build this up into memorial site material. So our concept and our idea is in the future, we are hoping that we can build in some of these areas, big places where we can put clothes, put stuff that will tell the story about what happened. And we pray that it will be soon, but that legislation is not yet there in Zimbabwe. Unlike in Rwanda, the context is that in Rwanda, you had people who were victims who are now in government. But in Zimbabwe, it's people who are alleged to have caused this genocide, who are still in government. So it's a different context and it's a bit difficult. So maybe the question as I round up is, how do we allow communities to grieve, to remember and to memorialize in a context where the perpetrator is still in charge, has got power over them? So this is our story as Zimbabweans. What I was talking to you about is stories of communities. I hope you heard the heart of those people who have been affected. So up to now, they are still grieving, they are still telling their stories, and we are still capturing it. So it's a collective memory. I think that their stories are similar to the other context. We might have just a different setting, but the pain that they are feeling, the anger that they have, the need to heal, to forgive and to move on is similar to any other context. It could be Northern Ireland, it could be in Rwanda, it could be in Zimbabwe or South Africa, because we are all humans, it's still there. Memorialization process is a proven mechanism for communities to begin that process of healing. And it's a backbone and foundation for truth-telling and enabling communities to trust, hope, and build social cohesion among themselves. Thank you so much. I think I'll take some of the issues through questions and answer sessions.
This is Derek Poole here. My video doesn't seem to be working, but can you hear me okay, everyone?
Yes, I can.
Yes, yeah. Yusini, thank you so much for that. We're going to hold the questions for now, and we're going to invite participants to put in some questions. And can I just remind the participants out there that you can click on a message on your toolbar below and send in some questions based on what you have already heard. Unfortunately, we're having some difficulties at the minute, and we are hoping to get Christoph back. I'm just waiting for some guidance on that. I think Diane is about to come online.
Okay, so unfortunately, Christoph, there's been an absolutely massive thunderstorm in Rwanda, in Kigali, where he is. So that is what's caused a problem. So he's going to try and get back on if the thunderstorm goes over. But I think we'll continue to move on with the other speakers. So Derek, if you could just introduce Sami Heenan, that would be great.
Yes, great, thank you. Yes, Sami Heenan is our third speaker today, and we're looking forward to hear what Sami has to say. Sami hails from Rathfriland, a place I remember well because I once drove a full-size bus up the hill, and anyone that's been there knows what that involves. And then the bus stalled halfway up the hill and the brakes began to fail. So that's my memory of Rathfriland. Anyway, we're delighted to have Sami with us today. Sami has been involved in issues of reconciliation by looking at the issues of victims and victims of violence. And that has been part of the challenge of his life for many years now. As you listen to him today, please consider putting forward some questions based on what he says. The best way really to speak, I think, of Sami and his experience and what he's trying to work through is through something personal, which of course was a murder within his own family. In Sami's own words, he says, "My father was murdered by the Provisional IRA on the 3rd of May, 1985. When I was 12 years old. My father and I lived alone in the rural Dramara Hills. My mother had died 3 years previously." Sami goes on to say, "I am passionate regarding issues of victims and strive to change and change the rewrite of our past," which is a fascinating comment that hopefully we'll be able to tease out. So Sami, you're very welcome, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say. And again, if the participants can be noting any questions based on what Sami says, so that would be greatly appreciated.
Thank you very much, Derek, for those words, and Diane, and thank to all the participants for their role here this evening. It's very much appreciated, and thank you for facilitating this event. I'm just going to start by quoting a verse of scripture. Malachi chapter 3 verse 16, "Then they that feared the Lord spake often to one another, and the Lord hearkened and heard it, and a book of remembrance was written before him for them that feared and that thought upon his name." In scripture, we often read of remembrance, and there are biblical precedents for laying stones as a memorial to the Lord in order to remember the good things he has done for us. There was no greater sacrifice which was made for the world than by him with his death on the cross of Calvary. And the most cherished remembrance of all for Christians is when we partake of the emblems in our respective communion services. Memorials and remembrance throughout the world have become an important element of the healing and reflection of those nations and peoples who suffered horrendously as a consequence of violence, wars, and genocide. There are no greater memorials contained anywhere than in the human mind, where we store the happiness and the momentous occasions we have had with those we have loved and lost. As victims of terrorism now in Ireland, we do find solace and have our own visible memorials which are precious to us. Whether it's the gravestone, the plaque, the banner, the inscription, the war memorial, the book, or indeed the social media post. And as you can see in this memorial tablet from my father, underneath the war memorial in Drumgoolan Parish Church, which is very precious to me. However, in Northern Ireland, others are using memorials which they eulogise, which they believe to be appropriate, which reinforce trauma, as they eulogise and glorify sinister individuals who inflict misery and bloodshed across our community. In Northern Ireland today, it is very difficult to move forward and facilitate the healing process when these visual reminders of it are still dominant and prevalent within our society, and where ordinary people have become conditioned to their presence. So how do we as victims reconcile that in terms of how we deal with matters of remembrance, healing, and forgiveness? As an only child, I lived in one of the most isolated and tranquil areas of Northern Ireland, the rural Dromara Hills, nestled at the foot of Slieve Crib, not far from the nearby town of Castlewellan. We lived in a small one-bedroom cottage on the roadside, and life for me was very normal until a sequence of tragedies occurred, starting on the 11th of December 1981 when I was 9 years old. On that snowy morning, my grandmother had been violently sick, and I was home alone with her that day as it was a heavy snowfall. We both sat down to watch television at around 4 p.m. I was sitting beside her, and at this point her head slumped forward, and she died in the chair sitting beside me. I immediately started to sob and cry, and I didn't know what else to do. And all I could do was run outside. I couldn't get anywhere with the heavy snow, and I was found in a very distressed and shivering state by my neighbours. 4 months later, I found my mother dying in her bedroom. We all went to bed, and my father had fallen, and I come well, and she appeared unconscious. I shouted across the room to her, but she didn't respond. I then wakened my father. So we had no phone, and I had to make the difficult journey half a mile away by bicycle to raise the alarm in the early hours to our nearest neighbour's house. But sadly, my mother died later that night as a result of a brain hemorrhage, aged only 43 years old. As a consequence, my father was all that I had left, and I idolised him. He stepped up to the level it was required to bring me up and adopt the roles which my mum and gran would previously have done. On the 3rd of May 1985, when I was 12 years old at around 7 a.m, my father came into our bedroom and told me to lie on. He was going outside to do the morning chores. I drifted back to sleep, only to be awakened by a painful piercing yell followed by a loud gunshot. I moved across the bed to look out the bedroom window, and I heard my dad's car start up. I traversed past my window where I could see a stranger driving it. The van drove away at speed. I suddenly felt a real sense of fear and unease descend upon me, as I knew the situation didn't seem right. I made my way outside, shouting for my dad over and over again. I just wanted the reassurance of an explanation. It was then, in the top yard, which you can see in the pic, that I witnessed a pool of blood and a smashed jug. I followed the trail of blood to the side of the barn, and there I found my father's lifeless body. The image of his blood-stained face and him lying on the ground will haunt me forever. At this point, I was standing alone in the middle of the countryside in pure isolation, shocked and numb at what I was encountering. We had only installed a telephone earlier that week, but in the panic, I forgot all about it. I then set off running again to the nearest neighbour's house, which was half a mile away. As I ran along the country road crying and sobbing, I hoped I would meet a car to secure help, but the roads are very quiet, as you'd expect in such a rural area. I eventually arrived at my neighbour's house in a very distressed state. The neighbours comforted me while they called the police. When we arrived back at my home, the cold realisation dawned on me that my daddy was dead. He was all that I had left in the world, and I was very traumatised. The emergency services arrived that morning with the forensics teams to seal off the scene while meticulously searching the area for clues. We deduced that the murder had been dropped off about 6:30 a.m, where he hid in an outside toilet until my dad came out. The gunman then walked up behind my daddy, forcing him to his knees before shooting him twice in the top of the head at point-blank range. The killer then dragged him by the feet to conceal the body around the side of the barn. 1 week later, the South Down, Southdown Provision IRA claimed the murder, stating my father was in the Royal Ulster Constabulary Reserve, which was totally untrue. He had been a member of the B Specials until they were disbanded in 1970. As a young child, I can remember the outpouring of grief coupled with anger and revulsion at my father's murder. People were so kind and generous towards me. My church and minister provided me with immense pastoral support at that time and for many years after. Life was difficult as I missed my parents immensely, and after the effects of such trauma, which never leave you, and the void growing up made life very lonely. All my life I have battled for truth, justice, and latterly against the incessant campaign to revise the narrative of our past. I have resigned myself to the reality I will not secure justice for my dad on this side of eternity. Ultimately, God will be their judge, and justice will then prevail. I will strive to confront the lies and deception of the organisation who murdered my father, and I will ensure the memory and the integrity of our loved ones is not sullied or destroyed by terrorist revisionism, which is now dominated by the Republican community within Northern Ireland. Not far from my father's murder scene, my local MP resides in a constituency office named after two provisional IRA terrorists, and in the same town there's a granite structure to fallen IRA men. I have been relentless in my campaign to expose these moral obscenities in a town where my father's killers came from. How can we, as a progressive society, in 2021 continue to countenance the name of this constituency office, which is subliminally designed to condition youthful mindsets and reinforce the evil of terrorist legitimacy? It's even more intolerable that it continues to be subsidised by the UK taxpayer. And this particular case that I refer to personifies the repugnancy and continued trauma we as innocent victims currently face by those who eulogise their brutal past. This is commonplace throughout Northern Ireland, and these memorials are morally wrong. As a Christian man, I cannot find the wrongdoers. As a Christian man, I cannot forgive the wrongdoers who visited misery on my home. I find it contemptible that their apologists continue to justify the death of my loved one and hundreds of others from both sides of our community. Many will argue that my expression goes against the grain of biblical teaching and would actually frown upon my sentiment, but I have to be honest and true to myself in how I feel. I am a forgiving person by nature, and I am not grudge-bearing. But the perpetrator of my father's murder and many others from the world of paramilitarism have never expressed remorse, repentance, or any form of restitution for their evil deeds. My pain today is still very real, and my journey continues to be difficult. Those who can move on, I applaud them. But the many who struggle and battle with our past, don't judge us. Respect us where we are. There are those who haven't suffered terrorism within the church community who actually can be quite judgmental on these matters. It's imperative the church today forgets about treading the delicate political path which has skewed their ability to articulate the prevailing hurt and trauma which is still evident and prevalent within the pews in Northern Ireland. They need to listen and respond accordingly, which I believe they are doing more so now than in previous years. It's imperative society and the church stands up for truth and justice, and in their sentiment, they must hold the wrongdoer to account as instructed in Scripture. Many churches have memorials in various forms to their sacrifice of their members, which should be uppermost in their minds when policies and respective victims are being addressed. God has richly blessed me in my life. I give him the glory for giving me a precious family back again, which I cherish with every ounce of my being. As a young man of 20, I trusted in Christ as my Saviour, and I had to confess my sin before I could strive for forgiveness for my wrongs. If the perpetrators of terrorism also confess their sin and sought forgiveness from the Lord, their deeds will be forgiven. If they don't, God will be their judge and eternal justice will prevail. And my forgiveness ultimately means nothing to them, so it's futile. The psalmist David said in chapter 34, verse 16, "The face of the Lord is against them that do evil, and to cut off the remembrance of them from the earth." When David faced the Philistine, he had to battle for the survival of his people. Today, we as Christians and victims who do battle are facing our own giant in so many forms. It is imperative we preserve the integrity and memory of our loved ones who gave their all, so as evil men could be defeated, so we in society from both the Protestant and Catholic community could enjoy a better and more prosperous future together. We can and we must succeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Seamus, for that. We appreciate the vulnerability and the openness of your presentation, and undoubtedly there will be a discussion around that later on this morning. Our fourth speaker is Shameless Mcdonald, and just a note again that before Seamus talks to us, that we're still trying to get Christoph back. There are some difficulties with that, and we will do our best. And also, if there's any questions from the two speakers that you've heard fully already this morning, please send those through. Seamus has been involved in peace and reconciliation issues and is particularly interested in the role of victims of violence in informing those initiatives. Seamus says he particularly values the voice that that constituency of people in the Northern Ireland context actually bring, and that it is necessary for us to include that voice, no matter how difficult and how painful that actually might be. For Seamus, the issue of our history of violence is not an abstract one, but it's a very personal one. People have experienced in very visceral ways the sectarian legacy and the conflict that created, and the many decades of insecurity, fear, violence, and death that we experienced. And of course, for Seamus, that personalization of the violence is very particular to him. He says, "I am a son of Rosalind and Mervyn McDonald, who were murdered by loyalist paramilitaries at their home on the 10th of July, 1976. I was a young child at the time and was in the room where the shooting occurred, along with my sister, Margaret, who was just a baby at that particular time." A personal story there, and a tragedy that in fact harmonizes with many other tragedies that people have experienced. So Seamus, you're very welcome, and we look forward for the next 10 minutes to your presentation.
Hi, hello. I take it I'm on.
That's you, Seamus, go ahead.
Okay. Hello, everybody. First, I'd like to thank Thrive and SEFF who put me in touch with this meeting today, and all the other participants that have spoke so eloquently and bravely, in Sonny's case, about their situations and their pasts. My own personal interest in the subjects comes from my own experience, as Derek stated. I grew up in West Belfast during the conflict that is known as the Troubles, and has had a profound effect on my life to this day. I was born in November 1974, a very violent time in the conflict in Northern Ireland, and by this stage over 1,236 people have been killed or lost their lives. I came from a very strong Republican family and from a very strong Republican area on the Falls Road in West Belfast. My mother and father, Rosaline and Mervyn McDonald, wishing for a better start in life, decided to move into a mixed area in the Longland Road in a different part of Belfast. The house had been previously owned by my grandparents, but they had to leave it after receiving a death threat because of the Republican activism in their politics. My parents weren't involved in any aspect of the conflict and lived for each other, myself, and by this point my younger sister, who was born a year after me. It was my family, and in that bubble of our love for each other, the shootings and the bombings and the civil unrest raged around us. On the 9th of July 1976, with the death rate from the Troubles now standing at 1,575 people, when my father made dinner, or as we call it, tea, and as my mother minded me and my baby sister, there was a knock on the door. My mother answered it with my baby sister in her arms, and two men entered the house claiming to be friends of my father and offered him work. When my father came to the kitchen to see what was happening, one of the men produced a submachine gun and proceeded to shoot my father at point blank range. After he killed my father, he then turned his gun on my mother, removed my baby sister from my mother's arms, and also shot her fatally. At that point, my mother and father became victims number 1,576 and 1,577 in a conflict that would go on for another 22 years and claimed, at a conservative estimate, 3,500 lives. The murder was later claimed by the UAFF, a loyalist paramilitary group, and they claimed that my mother and father were paramilitaries. This was a complete fabrication and a complete lie. My mother and father were just easy targets, and that's why we were visited upon by this evil. It does not need to be said that the events of that day have had both a long-lasting effect on my sister and my own life, and the sorrow and the loss and the trauma of that day echoes still within my whole family, or in some way with anyone who knew my parents. And in recent years, come to terms with my own issues around PTSD and grief. I have chosen with supports and many groups engaged with victims' issues and the peace and reconciliation to speak openly and honestly about my own thoughts around the concepts of victimhood and how best to move forward as a society together and acknowledging the pain on both sides. Which brings me to the topics of our event today. On the subjects of the immediate aftermath of any violent death, I was too young to remember anything about this time. Today, there is a greater understanding of what supports relatives need and need to come to terms with the shock and grief and anger that follows such events, whether that comes from the local community, their churches, or within their community itself. There can be an almost well-meaning response in the short term and the immediate aftermath, which can seem to fade all too quickly, leaving a sense of being forgotten. I think it would serve victims better to have some form of continuation in the long term, as the effects of loss can and do manifest itself many years after the circumstances have passed, and also can move on and pass on to the next generation. And it is important that the victims and survivors do not feel forgotten by the passing of time, and their grief can be as real and raw today, many years afterwards, as it was on the days and weeks that followed the incident. Following on from how best that we commemorate and remember victims within a post-conflict landscape, I can only really give my views and thoughts on my own experiences within Northern Ireland. Monuments and memorials are defined as commemorative, celebratory, or honouring those who have passed away or died, mostly whether in service for their country or a cause. Monuments for World War II, police and security forces, and within Northern Ireland, both Republican and loyalist paramilitary groups also have monuments. I'm not sure how I feel about the monuments as regards to paramilitary groups. I do believe that in any society, people have the right to mourn their dead, whether they be victims of war or atrocity. And that's anyone's right within a free society. We have seen in recent times with the Black Lives Matter protests that society's views can change over time on what is an acceptable point what is an acceptable memorial at one point in time may become unacceptable in the future. I believe that for the most part, monuments in some cases further the divisions within divided communities and can act as markers from one side or the other. It is true that with many this is very true with the many war memorials that are a feature in the Northern Ireland landscape, and there have been recent efforts to change this and make it a more positive, inclusive, and less paramilitary display of art, as it were. I personally think that there should be monuments which recognise the loss of all innocent victims and survivors of war and other conflicts, and that their prime purpose should be in place of reflection on the human cost of war and promote the peace and reconciliation so that these incidents do not occur again. In the research for the seminar, I've given a lot of thought on how best to remember those and who have been affected by trauma of any society, of any post-conflict society. It is my belief that we best honour those who have passed away by supporting those that are left behind. And this is happening today in Northern Ireland in many positive ways, but still through a polarised lens of different communities feeling more victimized than the other. Yet we all feel grief and loss in the same way. And this is just a fact of human nature. Nobody feels grief or their trauma or their loss any different than any other person. I found the sharing of personal stories and experiences of loss, of losing those we've loved, and how it has changed us for the better or worse, and how now we have found a way to cope, gives victims a voice and widens society's views, and hopefully the ability to empathise, would be the strongest way in which to move forward along with this memorials and monuments that would celebrate the lives of those that are victims and have been victimised by a conflict, while honouring their loss. I'm of the opinion that this would be the best served not just by granite monuments, but also with things like peace parks and places of reflection, where people could come and gather in the healing power of nature. These neutral centres, which would be inclusive of all faiths and backgrounds, could also be adorned with artwork and sculptures commemorating not war or battle or loss, but maybe a process of hope and reconciliation. Most of all, I believe that victims and survivors should no longer be viewed as people who just need help, but should be valued for having come through and witnessed some of the darkest parts of humanity and still believe that there is hope in the future. I would like to thank you all again and the other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Seamus, for that. Really appreciate it. We're still having difficulties getting reconnected with Christoph. People are working behind the scenes to see if
Christoph is back, so you can go into the discussion with Christoph.
Okay, well, we'll do that. We'll go straight into the discussion. We've had a number of questions come through, and for participants, please feel free, in the light of what you've heard to date, please feel free to send through a question. If you can keep it nice and short, that would be really helpful. I think we'll go to the Zimbabwean and Rwandan situation first. And there's a question here that says, why have neighbours in Rwanda and Burundi, why have neighbours, i.e. Rwanda and Burundi, so similar in terms of ethnicity, performed so differently in terms of reconciliation and restoration? So Eugenie and Christoph, that would be something that you might want to comment on.
I guess, Christoph, I can start, then I'll talk later.
Yes, thank you very much for that question. Yes, we have similar history background actually between Rwanda and Burundi, not only based on the so-called ethnicity, ethnic groups, but also we've been colonized by the same colonizers, the Belgians, and at one point actually we were all under that leadership from the Belgians. And we also have some similar history when it comes to violence and conflicts between the groups. However, yes, we have different approaches in terms of reconstruction and reconciliation. And I believe there are a few factors that have made that to happen. One is the political vision, because after the genocide in Rwanda, the government that was established had received so many advisors that people were telling them, these two groups of people cannot live again together. Please make sure that you separate them, have a side for the Tutsi, another side for the Hutu, because they cannot live together. But the question was, how do they separate these people? Because at the end of the day, they are all the same. We speak the same language. We live at the same communities. We've been have all these social relationships. How do you separate them wife and husband or children and others. And so the government made a clear choice of either if we die together, and if we live together. And that's one. But secondly, was the vision towards reconciliation and peace building. Because you cannot talk about reconciliation if you don't allow people to come to the same table and have an open conversation and discussion. And also reconciliation requires forgiveness and repentance. And those are very key pillars in the process of peace building and reconstruction of any post-genocide society. Therefore, with that vision of the Rwandan government and the Rwandan people of choosing to live together and choose to move forward with reconciliation, but as well as social justice, as well as providing justice after the genocide. And how could we be able as a country to provide opportunities to hear the truth about the genocide, to have perpetrators come forward and confess their crimes publicly if we had not chosen to be together. So, but in Burundi, in the other side, they have chosen different paths. And I think probably they have their way of interpreting the issues. And that is, if you look at them now, they're still struggling, honestly, to really know how to build and reconstruct the country again without allowing the space and the room for people to sit together and have the truth being shared and brought on the surface. So I think there are those few factors that have made that we have similar history, but we've chosen different paths when it comes to reconciliation and the reconstruction after the genocide and the violence.
Yuseni, you have some thoughts?
Well, I think the issue of political will is very important. I can actually give and see the similarity between Zimbabwe and South Africa. We all tried to go through a process of truth commissions dealing with the past, but South Africa has been so successful because of political will. The state is able to create space for that. I think when the state is not willing, when there's no political will, then you have a very big challenge as well. So in the Zimbabwean case, for instance, the state has not really been forthcoming. I see the difference between Rwanda and Burundi. I mean, like what Christopher is saying, I think a lot has to do with the approach from the state and how much is it willing to spend resources to have a vision for that. And I think in the case of Rwanda, they've had a very good run on it.
Yes, thank you. Sami and Seamus, when you hear the story, the Zimbabwean story and the Rwandan story, is there anything that strikes you?
I did when I was listening to both Christoph and USC speaking there. The thought occurred to me about the kind of suddenness of which the atrocities in both Rwanda and Zimbabwe seem to happen. In the context of Northern Ireland, our atrocities were spread out over a very long period of time and affected a multi-generational amount of people. And they are very, I think, given that long extended time period of conflict, that our society has become very, very entrenched. And that's a real challenge within the context of Northern Ireland, is that it's multi-generational, the division that exists within our society. And I think that could present it's a real challenge to try to overcome that there, because if it's not dealt with within one generation, which I get the impression that within Rwanda and Zimbabwe, you are taking really very positive steps. It's very inspiring to hear what you are willing to do. But maybe it would slightly be a different scenario, or maybe a longer process, given the length of time and the amount of hurt that was built up over that long period of time in regards to the conflict of Northern Ireland.
Thanks. Is Sami still with us? I've lost him from the screen. Possibly
Yes, can you
not.
hear me now, Derek? Yeah.
Yes, I can indeed. Tell me, have you any thoughts on what you've heard about the African situation?
Yeah, I just concur with the words are expressed by Seamus. Obviously, they're, I would say, further down the road in than what we are in many respects in Northern Ireland, how they're dealing with the past. So there appears to be, if I'm right, an acknowledgement that there was wrong perpetrated against innocent people. And that's the problem I find within the context of the troubles that happened here in Northern Ireland over a prolonged period of time. There's not an acknowledgement that there was wrongdoing within both factions of the paramilitary groupings. There's still, there's still a eulogizing, there's still sanitizing of the past, and that is very frustrating for us as innocent victims, as I've already alluded to in my speech. How do we handle that? How do we reconcile that? How do we move forward together? Because there was no justification for the taking of any life. And, Seamus or I could have went down that path. We both suffered horrendously as a consequence of paramilitaries, but I could not have visited misery and destruction in Ulladulla because I knew the pain that I encountered as a young child. So there has to be an acknowledgement first and foremost, and there has to be some form of contrition from the paramilitaries that the actions that they undertook were wrong, and there was absolutely no justification. So I do commend those in Rwanda and Zimbabwe for the journey that they have made so far, and obviously we can and we must learn from that, from their experiences.
Great, thank you. Just staying with the African situation at the minute, there's a question very pertinent in the light of the theological issues and the Christian demographic of Africa, and particularly in Rwanda, which, as we heard from Christophe, 90% of people consider themselves Christian. And the question is, how does a 90% Christian society arrive at genocide?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Derek, and has been often asked by so many people, especially in the Christian settings, wondering how that could happen. But let me start by saying that, yes, as we talk about Rwanda, let me mention that that's not only the case of Rwanda. When it comes to Christianity responding to division, hatred, and violence. In fact, I believe that the history of the Christian faith, I will call it has a violent background, because even going through the Bible and read all the stories, you see that, there has been so many violence and killings going on. And again, that has been translated even in the recent generations. However, the issue is that in the last few years, I think 4 or 5 years, the Church of Rwanda, church leaders, bishops have come together and have asked that same question. And they come up with a confession that's called the Musanze Declaration, whereby they acknowledged a list of failures that the church had undergone even prior to the genocide. And one is that people were more church members, denominational members, than being disciples of Christ. And therefore, the power and the importance of ethnic identity was more important than the Christian identity. And therefore, being a Tutsi or being Hutu was more primarily very important than being a Christian. So people find similarity and relationships from those ethnic identities than the Christian identity. But secondly, is that the church has lost an important piece of its responsibility, which is the prophetic voice. The church has been very much married with the government, the politicians. Thus, there's no differences. Like, they have lost their role in the society and they have been manipulated and used by the politicians for their own interests. And some church leaders were involved in the propaganda, in the genocide directly, but also they were the ones really educating people and applying all the divisive laws that were in the country prior to the genocide. That's why today we have so many former church buildings which are now currently genocide memorials. Why? Because the people were seeking for refuge from the church buildings and they couldn't get that. And why? Because the prophetic voice had been completely lost from the church as a body of Christ. But thirdly, I think again comes with the whole background of religious in Africa in general. Because division is already in the roots of Christianity in Africa. Today,
we have a frozen moment again. Eugenie, would you like to, while we're waiting, hopefully get Christoph back fairly soon. Eugenie, would you, any thoughts on that idea that, as we heard from Christoph there, that church-going people can be captivated by cultural identities and political identities and caught up in ideas of who they are based on a kind of aberration of faith, and to the point where what we consider Christian faith to represent in terms of ethical behavior, in terms of nonviolence, in terms of the rites of passage that we consider Christians to go through, and that influence on society. What is it that happens in your experience in Zimbabwe when the church appears to be part of the problem?
Yeah, well, I think one of the key issues that Christopher raised is the fact that if the church loses its prophetic role, you have a very big problem. But also, secondly, the church must keep a strategic distance between itself and the government. We have seen this even in America, nationalization of Christianity, where Christianity becomes very national and in character. So the issue of discipleship, following Christ closely and his teachings, is very important. I think the church lost it. We have a missionary church in Africa that was not taught the Bible, but it was taught culture as well. So you find that the church in Africa did not go deep enough in terms of understanding what it means to be a follower of Christ, what are the principles and characters. But this is universal. That's why in America right now there's a big problem on nationalization of faith because of the same problem. So theology, I think we need to revisit our theology, but also the understanding God's as design, or what is in the heart of God about justice, about peace, about the sanctity of life, and that we are all equal. That's why in South Africa, apartheid was based on theology. You know, the separation between blacks and whites was literally driven by a church, which believed that blacks were lesser than whites and so forth. So I'm saying, once our theology gets off the rails, it's dangerous. And it can fuel religious, ethnicity, religious divisions. Here in Zimbabwe, the church has been silent, some aspects of the church, but I'm glad to say we have some of the church leaders who have been in the forefront of fighting against injustice and fighting for peace.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Seamus, Sammy, have you any thoughts on that? The Irish situation and experience, of course, was shot through with religious ideas, and certainly up until recent times, the issue of Protestant and Catholic has been a major identifier in our conflict. Have you any thoughts about the theological contribution or lack thereof that came from the churches during our situation?
Yeah, I cannot, only being a child coming up through the Troubles, it did seem to me that the two churches were they weren't really stoking the fires of hatred, but they weren't really fanning them out. They weren't calming them down at all either. Like they didn't. I don't think they did enough to try to build bridges, to try to calm the situation down. I presently don't live in Northern Ireland. I've chosen not to live in Northern Ireland anymore. It's too hurtful for me, and I actually would struggle with living with that sense of division that's still there today. Within Northern Ireland and Ireland, whether you're Unionist, Republic, whatever, there is a role to be played by the Republic of Ireland, I think, in bringing about a more inclusive society within the North. The thing I find about living down in the Republic of Ireland is I've never been asked if I'm a Catholic or Protestant, not once. This isn't a question my children would ever be asked either, but it's a question you'd live in fear of in the North. It's just generally how you're picked on a side. And it doesn't really matter what religion or what lack of religion you choose to be, you're still going to be defined as whether being a Protestant or a Catholic. That does not exist down here. And I think that within the context of Northern Ireland, that maybe trying to utilize the state in the Republic to use it as a middle ground in which people can come to and share their experiences, and within that, there for the Republic of Ireland to accept its role in the conflict in Northern Ireland and how it perpetrated within it and how it continued to go on. And I think it needs to be an all Ireland healing process. I think that by maybe involving the Republic of Ireland, that you might be able to step a wee bit beyond the Protestant and Catholic question and just really bring it back to what I think are the core principles, which is the victim and the loss of life, and what value and what worth victims can bring within a society, because it's we who suffered most, and it's we who suffer most to this day, but it's also us that represent the biggest and most positive change for peace, in my opinion.
Great, thank you. Sammy, have you any thoughts?
Well, you know, there's characteristics of what happened, obviously, in Rwanda and Zimbabwe within the context of Northern Ireland, and that before the Troubles, outbreak of the Troubles, people lived in relative harmony in their respective communities. They lived, they worked, they socialised together, and then the communal strife took hold for a variety of reasons. And then we asked ourselves the question, and how in a civilised society, which was obviously from the Protestant Roman Catholic traditions, how did people descend into an orgy of violence and destruction? Like, how was a road on the Shankill, how was it capable of producing 17 serial killers? How was in rural Northern Ireland, what motivated members of the Catholic Community Provisional IRA to try and eradicate their Protestant neighbours from the land? So, there's obviously these issues happen from both communities. There was fear, there was a whole multiplicity of reasons how that situation evolved. But from a Christian perspective, I suppose it goes back to what we're commanded to do in Scripture, and that Scripture states very clearly we're all born in sin, and we're all shaping iniquities, because there's no end to what of man's depravity, what man is capable of as a result of that. And I suppose when we come into the Christian context, that we can find that peace that passes all understanding, and if we put our hope and we put our faith and trust in Jesus Christ as the Lord and Saviour of our life, and that is the answer in all accounts. But we know that's people go down their own path, and sadly within Northern Ireland that what happened. And as for the role of the church, the church had their role to play throughout the Troubles, and the church provided for both communities great pastoral support to bereaved families, and I was a recipient of that in terms of how my church dealt with my situation, and we're at the situation today where I have criticisms of the church in that, and I think some of our speakers related to that, and sometimes it must be clear that the church has to stay separate from the policies of government. And in many cases, I do find personally the government tends to have a role of appeasement, and the church needs to stay away from that. And the church needs to listen primarily to the views of the people in their pews and listen to what they have to say and understand their hurt, embrace that, and the policies they implement needs to be victim-centered if they're going to talk about victims' issues. But, you know, we look around the world, we look at, like, I mean, how did a civilized society like Germany, how did it descend into electing someone like a tyrant of Hitler and the evil that he perpetrated? How did society allow that? And we're back to the point that I made again about the sin of the world and what there's no man's inhumanity man, and there's no length men won't go on particular issues and particular causes.
Great, thank you. There's some themes emerging in the questions that are coming in, and I'll read one question that encapsulates what a number of people are asking. The question is, when we suggest that all stories are equally valid, does that put the story of the perpetrator on the same level as that of the victim, either morally or practically? That's pertinent to all four of you because the African situation has had to face that challenge. I believe the Rwandan situation had mechanisms put in place that were based on that challenge. And of course, in the Northern Irish context, we are labouring to come to terms with those dilemmas. So maybe if we could start with our two African brothers first, and then get some comment from our local participants. Christoph?
Yes, Derek, thanks again. Just give me a few seconds, really 1 second to add one comment on the theological question. I think as Hussein said, I think we need to revisit our theology because the theology has been more informative theology than being transformative theology. And therefore, the result and the outcome of the informative theology is where people have memorized the verses of the Bible, but not allowed them to sink in their hearts and transform them. And that's a big challenge in the context of violence. Back to the question that you have asked about the stories and allowing all these stories to be heard, and the questions about perpetrators versus victim of survivor stories. I think in our context, in the context of Rwanda, those two stories don't have the same value and the same weight because, yes, they're all stories and they all contribute to reveal the truth of what happened during the 1994 genocide. However, they have different weight and different values in the healing process. Because again, we have to remember that the role of the story or the stories, one, it's allowing the truth to be told and shared and brought on the surface. But secondly, it's also for the purpose of healing, the community healing and the individual healing. And thirdly, it's also allowing that people and the young generation will learn from the elderly and the experienced people so that they might not repeat the history. For instance, CARSA has a program where we take genocide survivor and perpetrator who are already in the journey of forgiveness and reconciliation, and we take them into schools and they share their stories with young people. And both survivor and perpetrators, we share their stories. But again, what's the role and the importance of these stories? One, the story from the perpetrator is to emphasize and reveal that's what happens real, because there's a tendency of denial. And then if we don't allow the story from the perpetrator, it's, yes, the survivor will share the story, but who confirms that? We need the perpetrator who was a part of that to share the story and allow to confirm the event and the violence. But also, the story of the perpetrator contribute to the healing of the survivor. Why? Because when the perpetrator is courageous enough to share what happened, his role in the violence, and then ends the story by acknowledging that what he did or they did was evil and confessing toward the survivor, then that contributes to the healing of the survivor. but also it reveals sometimes in our context, most of the issues that the survivor did not know, like how their beloved one were killed. Because everyone who survived in Rwanda was hidden somewhere, either in the bush or somewhere, and they don't know much about how their beloved one have been killed. So the story of the perpetrator actually contribute to the healing of the survivor by revealing more details of how their beloved one have been killed, and thus also allowing the healing because they end their story by acknowledging, by confessing, and asking for forgiveness. In the story of the survivor, of course, it's very also important for the healing of the survivor, but also for bringing hope, because the story of the survivor has to lead toward bringing hope. And that's why when it's come together, the never again has a meaning. Otherwise, if the never again is being spoken by the survivors without the voice of the perpetrator, it's like a survivor saying, never again, I don't want to be killed, as if you have chosen to be killed. Never again has to come from the perpetrators. And that's, it has to come through their stories. Thank you.
Seamus, have you any thoughts on that question?
Well, in a small way, that is beginning to happen within Northern Ireland. After recent uprising and disturbances in Derry, which culminated in, well, there was a massive recruitment drive from both Loyalist and Republican paramilitaries in Derry. It's kind of ongoing at the minute. The journalist Laura McKee was murdered while reporting on a riot. Me and a few people I work with in the Hollywell Trust decided that it would be a good idea to hold a series of talks within schools. And within that there, I agreed to do a talk with an ex-member of the UDA who was actually a quartermaster for the UDA. The UDA were affiliated or basically controlled the people that murdered my parents. It was obviously a very challenging thing for me to meet with James. He'd served time for explosives and arms and I don't know what else. But I met him as an individual and as a human being who had actually chosen to walk away from the life that he had lived after he'd been in jail. As hard as it was for me to accept his actions of his past, I tried my best to see the man that it was before me. And I believe that the talks that we did, both were, there was 2 talks in schools and then 1 talk within a youth reach group. And the purpose of me and James sharing the story was to, James could portray what it was to join a paramilitary organization and how it had a detrimental effect on his life. And at the same time, I could mirror that with what the effects of these organizations' actions are and how they don't really serve anyone but their own leaders, as it were. Like, so I think there is an element of that starting to come into Northern Ireland, but with Northern Ireland, there's so much secrecy around the murders of our loved ones. There's so much unknowns. The case involving my mother and father, there's hints of collusion. There's hints of all the things that seem to tie in with a lot of the atrocities in Northern Ireland. And that goes both on Loyalist and Republican sides. Like the Loyalists or the Unionists are asking the same questions about collusion from state forces in the murder of their loved ones that the Republicans are. And I find it awful frustrating that there's so many similarities, yet there's this complete disconnect and this lack of wanting to come together and accept that the hurts were done across both communities and that we're all asking the same questions. And I think that given the secrecy and the lack of wanting to be forthright with the information about the murder of our loved ones from both the state and the security forces, it poses a real stumbling block for people to move on, and it keeps the wounds festering. And I think basically what Northern Ireland needs is something like what would happen in Rwanda, where the Band-Aid is just ripped off and people just talk about what happened. And the people that are brave enough to come into that middle ground, whether they be victims or perpetrators, I think they need some support. I have no real love for perpetrators of violence, but I can understand that in a certain way there can be a certain amount of victimhood with them. If you take a disenfranchised 14-year-old lad, either from a Republican or a Loyalist background, and he's no work and he's no hope and he's no future, and you offer him an organization that will give him money as long as he's doing what he's told. He's no more, he's as big a victim of circumstance at that point before he makes decisions of his own. And I think that has to be in some way respected, as difficult and as challenging that is. A lot of people that were in these organizations are probably looking back on their lives and are full of remorse and have no way of expelling that or expressing it, either through fear of reprisals from the organizations or being judged by their community. And I think that's going to present a real challenge going forward in the peace process in Northern Ireland. But at the same time, if we could accomplish it, I think it would have a hugely beneficial effect across the community.
Eugenie and then Sammy, your thoughts on the status and role of the perpetrator?
Obviously, angle that he wants to be very difficult. I actually can't forgive the word father, because I had you more, so they had a glow. And obviously people that perpetrated my father, the apologists are very fantastic and skilled propaganda machine. I can't even get my local MP, my Sinn Féin MP, to condemn the murder of my father, and I've repeatedly challenged him. As I say, I go to the local town of Castlewellan, and there's a memorial to fallen IRA volunteers. There's an MP's office, as I said, named after two prominent Republican activists. So how do we move on? How do we reconcile that? And as one of the contributors already said, there has to be an acknowledgement that what happened here over 30 years was wrong. And I'm not seeing that. I'm seeing a revisionism now that is now manifesting itself in generations of young people coming forward, that there was a romanticism, there was some sort of honor. The talk of the military speak as if there was some sort of glory, walking up behind innocent people and shooting them twice in the top of the head. It takes a especially depraved, unhinged individual to do that. So what was the circumstances to allow that to happen? I had as much justification as anyone to go out and lift the gun, and I'm sure I wouldn't have went too far to find people were wanting to exploit my vulnerability. But I had not the capability, I had not the will or desire, because I could not have went out and hurt someone else, because I wasn't brought up that way. I was brought up in a unionist home, and I have to say today I'm still very passionate, and we're talking about politics. I'm a passionate unionist. So I do stand up for that, and there's no conflict there, because we have to have the negotiate, or have to have the discussion when we do the discussion. But you know, we're in a situation now in Northern Ireland where it is paramount that we convey to the new generation the abhorrence of violence and what happened here. But as I say again, there are others who are not down that path, and even if we have some sort of truth and with some sort of commission, how do we know those people, the terrorists, both sides, are going to tell the truth? Because I'll be honest, I don't believe a word that they would say. They're in denial. And so how do we reconcile that? How do we move beyond that? So it does create many problems going forward. And I know maybe it's controversial to say it, but I do see one faction of paramilitarism. And as I say, they're well skilled, they're well oiled. And but both, I'm saying, one set of paramilitaries here is a political wing, the other side haven't. Because I do find that within my community, there was largely a rejection right throughout Northern Ireland of what loyalist paramilitaries were doing. They weren't doing it in my name. But sadly, within the Republican community, they have a political machine. And they do see many people try to glorify what happened. So I don't see some sort of truth commission. It's not going to reveal all, and I don't think I would get anything positive out of it. That doesn't mean to say like Seamus and I and different other people can't have that discussion, but I don't see it as being a positive development, because there's not an acknowledgement of what happened here was wrong over 30 years.
You see any in the Zimbabwean context, the perpetrator is the state.
Yeah, well,
how do we manage that?
Yeah, well, the challenge we have is first in terms of storytelling. The story of the perpetrator is very important. Like here in the Zimbabwean case, to finish the wall, if I can put it that way. If you hear only the victim story, the survivor story is 50%. The other 50% must come from the perpetrator. But for this reason, first, it brings healing to the survivor. I think the survivor needs to know what happened. Why did you do what you did to me? It's part of the healing process. Secondly, it helps in the truth recovery process. We need to know the truth. It's part of remembering, it's part of memory. You know, the perpetrator, in science, is justice. He has to say, why did he do what he did? You know, we might never agree with him or with her, but we have to accept that at that particular moment, that's why they did what they did. So it's part of the journey towards forgiveness and reconciliation. So the perpetrator's story is very important in that journey of forgiveness and reconciliation. But also it's important for a nation to recover the truth. Why did this incident happen where so many people were killed? Who was behind it? Why did they do it? We need to know that so that it will never happen again. We begin to put a resolve as a nation to say, look, this must never happen again. And in order for that to happen, we need to have both stories on the table. And for us in Zimbabwe, we're still going, it's a journey, we're still going to that, to get the story from the perpetrator, what happened. The communities that we work with, one of the big missing pieces in their lives is to hear the story of the perpetrator. Because what they only remember is this army truck coming, men shooting, men tearing people's stomachs, men chopping babies, men burning, you know, households, houses and everything. But why did they do that? It's a missing piece that people need to know. Why did you kill my father? Why did you brutally kill my mother? Why did you slit the throat of my father? Why did you do that? Why did you shoot him? So the victim will, their journey to healing involves knowing the story, knowing the truth.
Great, thank you. There's a number of questions around the role of the church in this. We've already touched on the church being captivated by other identities, cultural identities, political identities. But in terms of what the church and its responsibilities are now in the post-conflict situations of all of our scenarios, what is the role of the church? What contribution can the church bring to dialogue? How does it facilitate that? You know, on the issues of memorialization, which we've heard a lot of positive comment as something that is necessary for processing, and yet memorialization itself can be another profound form of division and alienation. Matter of fact, memorialization is epic in the Northern Ireland context, and unlike the Rwandan situation, we have no focus, no commonly agreed focus for memorialization. Also issues of dialogue, also spaces for telling our story, safe spaces for telling our story. What's your thoughts as panelists on how the church can contribute to those thorny issues and how we get unstuck from not knowing what to do with some of those? Can the church be of value? Can the church be of help? Can the church facilitate safe spaces? Is it possible for some kind of declaration like the one that was forged in Rwanda from the churches could act as a cohesive system whereby conversations that we have not been able to have are made possible? Christoph, could you start with that?
Thanks, Derek. Yes, you've already mentioned some of the things that should be the role of the church in this whole process. But let me start. That's the first step that the church should provide. It's acknowledging its failure. Because I think if you look around the world and you see the role of church and faith, it has an important piece. And the church cannot bring any positive contribution before it actually acknowledges the failure and also acknowledge that has lost, as the Bible says, when the salt is very important, but when the salt has lost the, how do you call that again in English? Like,
savor.
The taste, the savor. Yeah. Then it's completely, it's useless. You throw it away because without that, it's just a simple stone and you throw it away. And I think the church has lost that and have to acknowledge that have lost that and then plan how to bring it back. But secondly, the church has to create structures within the church itself as an institution, whereby only not providing spaces, but also becoming an advocate for the weak and the victims, and be the agents, the forefront agent to promote forgiveness and reconciliation. Why? Because repentance and forgiveness are more theological concept than being political or social cultural. So therefore, the church holds that. And if that's really kind of included in the structure, and the church creates spaces for people to be heard and have the space to speak and provide also space for the healing, that's what the church can do. And finally, I believe that the church has an important role to play when it comes to shape the post-genocide, or the post-violence or the post-conflict vision. Why? Because in most conflicts also, we see the political battle where politicians are fighting, where the political ideologies are more brought ahead and they are more considered on the top of the people, the community. So because the church should not have a political agenda, and thus the church should be the one contributing and leading towards the creating a space and the vision for forgiveness and reconciliation, because the church shouldn't be playing or seeking for any political or power or anything beside of being and providing that prophetic voice. So if the church could do so, yes. Otherwise, I think in the challenge is, again, in most cases, when the church don't provide that, then the issue becomes who we do that. Because politicians are only following their political agendas. And the politician will play with whatever is happening in a few countries in the world. That's what happened in the US, where churches are being manipulated, used by politicians, and people don't know what to trust and who to follow. So the church should play that role to be the light in the darkness and show the way towards the shaping the vision of the future and for forgiveness and reconciliation.
Great, thank you. Sammy, have you any thoughts on the role of the church in our post-conflict society?
Yeah, well, throughout the Troubles, well, there was many losses of some of the most dreadful situations that families faced. The church, I feel, was there in many instances, sometimes at a more parochial level. Sometimes, the minister was there and provided the strength of support that families needed and articulated adequately at the pulpit, maybe the day of the funeral afterwards in the press. People felt a sense of connection there. And sometimes the establishment, the hierarchy of the churches failed. And as we go through the Troubles to 1998 and the Belfast Agreement, which was heralded as a new dawn, a new start for Northern Ireland, I think in many respects, the church lost its way. And I can't speak for all, I can only speak for the people that I know within the victims community. Maybe at that time, the church sort of bought into the political agenda as if somehow the Good Friday Agreement was dressed up as the terms of the reconciliation. This was everything over now, a new start, and in many respects, the troubles were over from the point of view of killing each other. But sadly, at that time, we as victims, we had to endure the spectacle of the prison release program, as I referred to it. That was the earthquake, and in many cases, victims have been feeling the aftershocks ever since. And there's a lot of hurt there. There's been a lot of hurt post Good Friday Agreement within the pew, and the church needs to articulate that. They need to listen intently to what their people are saying. And sometimes I felt over this past 20 years, the hierarchy of the churches did not do that. And sometimes if you're following a particular narrative, the church will embrace you better than if you go against the grain. And I would say maybe as I maybe alluded to, feel as if sometimes I go against the grain because there's not an acknowledgement. I can't forgive the people who murdered my father because there's not an acknowledgement that what they were perpetrated was wrong. And sometimes then, I can't forgive. So I know I've been blessed to be able to share my testimony around many different churches, various denominations. And I know there's a few churches that I've heard in the grapevine don't want me to speak at them because I can't. I'd be honest and say that I cannot forgive the people who murdered my father because I have not seen any remorse, repentance, 3 hours or restitution. But I think now over this past few years, I feel there is a wee bit of a sea change where I have been in various seminars and dialogue meetings, and where there has been acknowledgement that they are now listening, I feel, and they're now articulating what people are feeling. But it's still now I think the hierarchies of the church are acknowledged, but sometimes at a parochial level there's a fear and anxiety. And anybody who knows Northern Ireland, I know one church where the local RUC was the local police force wanted to present their crests, and the church refused to facilitate that because of this Nero. I didn't want to offend, and they bought into this, the whole toxic nature of, sometimes I thought, that subliminally bought into the revision of many who had believed this was a police force not fit for all. So, but that caused hurt by a number of families in that particular church because people didn't want to acknowledge that, this was a perfectly legitimate police force who served both sides of the community and lost over 300 members. So there is, it's a journey, but it's important that the church acknowledges the hurt and listens to that hurt and articulates that hurt.
All right. Thank you for that. Euseini, just a brief comment from you on the role of the church, and then James, a brief comment from yourself if you've any thoughts.
Look, the church has got convening power, number one, to bring everyone together, but it can provide safe spaces. That's what we're already doing. We are using more than 40 churches in 40 different locations to bring together victims, create safe space for victims to come and speak. But our desire is on the same space to bring together the perpetrator and the victim to engage. I think if we look at the Rwandan example, the church has already done that as well. So I believe the church has got that power. Plus also our gospel is that of reconciliation. If you look at now, we're going into Easter. There's a lot of symbolism around reconciliation, forgiveness, being unjustly accused, and people perpetrating violence against someone who's innocent. So we can use church symbolism for memory. For the church is already memorializing a lot of its theologies around memory, its theologies around remembering. So we can use those tools that we already have to help the communities. Yeah.
Thank you. Seamus, just a few comments from yourself. I'm particularly interested in you looking in from the outside, having now living in the Republic, and looking at a space that you said has given your children a certain freedom from the Protestant and Catholic labels and identities. As you look at the situation, both in Ireland in general, but certainly up north here, how do you see the church's contribution to the future?
For instance, I think today is a good example of how religious organizations can bring about a place in which people can share and talk, and I think that's pretty evident in the circumstances of, say, just me and Sammy being able to share a screen together. I think there's a lot of people in our side or each side of our community wouldn't consider being able to do this, but I think it's a very positive thing. And just this as an example shows the way forward in which religious organizations could play a key role in bringing about some sense of reconciliation. I'm not a practicing Christian in any way. I was baptized a Catholic. My children aren't baptized. I didn't bring them up with any particular religious ethos. I believe that would be up to themselves if they want to acquire that in life. I do respect all religions, and I do believe that at the heart of all religions there is the basic principle of loving thy brother and respect for your brother. And I think if they follow through on that there, they could play a role in, maybe they've missed the generation at this point in regards to the North, but generally as the new generation comes up to combat this kind of romanticism about the troubles and the causes and stuff, if the churches can find a way to engage with the next generation and use the people that are within their congregation at the minute and that are willing to accept some kind of crossing of a bridge or some kind of building in which they could contact both Catholic and Protestant churches, they should take that role. I think it should be at the heart of the church's role to want to do that. I believe it would benefit a lot of Christian organizations, which I know are suffering from a drop in membership across the world at the minute, to portray themselves not as being affiliated to politics in any way whatsoever at all, but to more really truly put forward the concept of them being more concerned about people's spiritual well-being, or be it their soul.
Great, thank you for that. And unfortunately, we've run out of time. I want to say a couple of things just before I hand it back to Diane for some closing comments. Firstly, thank you so much to all the panelists for your contributions. I think it's been a difficult environment. Obviously, the Zoom sort of medium isn't always helpful, but I feel a tremendous amount of important things were said, and I think the delegates today will have some things to consider. I want to thank the delegates for really a tremendous amount of comment and questions that we had to pull together in some way, and particularly to let the panelists know, or the panelists know that there was a lot of affirmation from the delegates about things that you were saying, a lot of gratitude, and you can probably read those later. I'm going to hand this back over to Diane that's got a few closing things to say.
Yes, I want to add my thanks to all the speakers. It has been, although we were running around madly in the background trying to get Christoph back on, his electricity went off because of a massive rain shower, and we want to apologise. But thank you, Christoph, for really managing to get back in. I've asked Kenny Donaldson from SEFF to come and join us too, because I know he just wants to say make a few comments before we finish. And Kenny, if you can hand back to me, I just need to do a couple of other things around the evaluation at the end.
Really. Thanks, Diane, and thanks to particularly participants here this morning. I think we have had 4 incredibly brave people speak, from our friends over in Africa, but also locally here on both sides of the border. I think something that has come up very much within each of your addresses is the sanctity of human life. And whenever there's an agreement around the illegitimacy of violence, then everything else is just the detail and can be worked through. But it's the denial of that principle which makes things very, very difficult. So I just want to say that on behalf of SEFF here, We're delighted to be able to work with Thrive Ireland on this particular project, and also to thank Derek, you for your role there today, and all that have made the effort to link in. And of course, we encourage people to engage with future sessions on the next 2 Fridays thereafter. But obviously, we hoped very shortly that as an organisation we would be going out to Rwanda to spend time with Christoph and others. That will be delayed now for another 12 months, but it will all be in God's timing, and it's for the good that this obviously has happened. But I just want to say again, thank you so much for all the prep and way in which you've conducted yourselves today, the efforts you've put behind all of this, because you had to tease through very, very difficult issues in prepping for today, bringing you back to those spaces of when that injustice was brought into your life. And we're proud to have Sammy and Seamus both within our organisation, and that they go forward and continue to speak the message that violence was wrong. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kenny. And I mean, for Thrive Ireland, it was a real privilege to be a part of that. I also want to thank Norman Hamilton and Contemporary Christianity for partnering with us on this as well. And of course, for the Community Relations Council, who provided the funding for this. I'm delighted that this has been able to happen. And I would encourage any of the participants to think about registering, if they haven't, for next Friday at the same time, which is, the theme is grief and forgiveness. And Christoph is once again a speaker. And then there is a colleague of his called Josephine, who is also from Rwanda. And the 2 SEFF speakers are the Reverend Alan Irwin and the Reverend David Clements. So I would encourage you, you're going to be sent an evaluation, and please, we really want to try and do more of this. We would really value your feedback. Thank you for all the questions that came in, and some of the ones that we weren't able to get to. There just isn't enough time. And in this land of Zoom that we live in, it's just, we can't spend huge amounts of time. It's just so tiring. But thank you to everybody once again. Thank you to all who participated, and thanks to the speakers. And God bless until we see you next week, and hopefully the week after. Bye-bye, everybody.